Hey guys, tonight we're heading into something a little colder and a lot more real. Forget the feasts and festivals. This is about the freezing truth of medieval life. When the rivers turned to ice, the bread ran out, and even the church bells froze silent. We're diving into how ordinary villagers survived the worst winters in history, when warmth was a luxury and hope was a habit. No kings, no knights, just the people who quietly endured it all. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy falling asleep to a bit of history. And tell me in the comments where you're tuning in from, and what the weather's like where you are tonight. Now, dim the lights, maybe pull up a blanket, and let's step back into a world where winter wasn't just a season. It was survival. When the river froze solid, life during the Great Winter of 1434, the cold that wouldn't end. It began quietly, as great disasters often do, not with thunder or panic, but with the small, unremarkable chill of early November. The year was 1434, and across much of northern Europe, people had grown accustomed to hardship. Famine had been a recent memory, pestilence and unwelcome guests still lingering in the corners of the continent. But this winter would outstay them all. By the first week of December, frost had crept into the thatch of roofs and the joints of doors. The River Thames, once the lively artery of London's trade, began to seize along its edges, forming crystal teeth that grew day by day. At first, villagers along its banks took it as a sign of a proper winter. But as days shortened and fires burned longer, people began to notice that the ice was not receding. It was thickening. Peasants awoke to find their wells frozen solid, forcing them to hammer at the surface each morning for water. Livestock, those precious breathing stores of wealth, huddled close in barns so cold that breath turned to frost on their muzzles. Across England, from Yorkshire to Kent, stories spread through market chatter of mill wheels that would not turn, of ale that froze inside its barrels, of fingers blackened and lost to frostbite. What few written accounts we have come mostly from the literate, monks, minor officials, and chroniclers, but the reality of the cold was felt most deeply by those who left no record. Villagers, wives, field laborers, shepherds whose flocks perished in the night. In Norfolk, a scribe named John of Ely wrote in his ledger, "It is as though the sun himself has taken ill." And indeed, even the daylight seemed sickly, thin, pale, incapable of warmth. The sun rose late and sank early, leaving 14 hours of darkness. People began to divide their days not by clocks, but by chores that could be done before their oil lamps sputtered out. The rhythm of village life, already dictated by seasons, grew even slower. Fields lay empty, the soil as hard as stone. Bread ovens cracked from the cold. The only movement came from the endless work of keeping warm, gathering wood, patching roofs, huddling around hearths that barely glowed. Firewood was a kind of currency now. Those with small coppices or rights to the forest became quietly powerful. But what truly tested survival was not just the cold itself, it was how long it lasted. Weeks passed. The usual thaw around Christmastide never came. January arrived sharper and crueler, with frozen winds from the north that howled through every crack in timber and bone alike. Entire rivers froze deep enough to bear wagons. In London, makeshift stalls appeared atop the ice, and what later generations would call the first frost fairs took shape. Bakers sold hot pies, blacksmiths mended tools, and jugglers performed atop what had once been the Thames' restless current. It might sound festive, even charming, as if humanity had triumphed over nature by turning hardship into merriment. But behind the laughter was hunger. Food stores, never abundant, were dwindling fast. Grain spoiled in damp barns. Rats, driven from the frozen ground, gnawed through sacks of barley. The poor resorted to grinding chestnuts, acorns, even dried peas into coarse flour that barely held together as bread. The wealthy fared little better, for their servants and tenants could not bring them what didn't exist. By midwinter, salted meats, once a reliable winter provision, had become a rare delicacy. And so people improvised. Villagers learned to stretch every resource. The fat scraped from animal hides became tallow for lamps. The dregs of old ale were boiled and mixed with porridge to make something vaguely edible. Those near the coast fished through holes cut in ice or collected stranded eels left gasping in frozen shallows. For many, that was the only fresh protein they'd see until spring. Inside small cottages, smoke curled low and thick. Walls blackened with soot. The air smelled of damp wool, wood smoke, and desperation. Sleep came early, not out of peace but from exhaustion, and from the instinct to conserve warmth. Families often slept together under one pile of blankets and straw, a human furnace against the biting air. Yet amid this grim endurance, there was a strange sense of togetherness. Survival was not individual, it was communal. The medieval villager could not survive alone. Neighbors shared tools, kindling, and gossip in equal measure. Even the local lord, often seen as distant or cruel, understood that his wealth was useless if his peasants perished. Some opened their storehouses, grudgingly or otherwise, and distributed grain. Churches became refuges, not just for the soul, but for the body. Stone walls, though cold, offered some insulation from the wind. Candles burned day and night. Monks prayed, but they also boiled weak broth for the poor and buried those who succumbed to the cold. Parish bells tolled almost daily. The psychological toll was immense. When every day looked and felt the same, a blur of gray sky and white ground, people began to measure time by losses. The death of an ox, the last loaf of bread, the final candle stub. Chroniclers later wrote of a sadness that hung like frost upon the heart. And yet, humans are stubborn creatures. Even in the coldest months, life continued. Children were born, marriages held, and markets reopened whenever the air softened, if only for an hour. People still laughed, though their laughter came through chapped lips and trembling hands. The mundane persisted, taxes collected, sermons preached, gossip whispered. Civilization, in its dull, determined way, refused to freeze entirely. By February, rumors spread of starving wolves venturing into villages from the woods. Fires were kept burning all night, not just for warmth, but for safety. The cry of a wolf on a distant ridge was enough to send mothers clutching their children close. But wolves, too, were desperate. They rarely attacked. More often, they scavenged the bodies of animals already dead from cold. And then, when people began to lose hope entirely, when some said that perhaps this was the end of the world, the punishment of God for human sin, something subtle changed. Around the middle of March, the wind shifted. It no longer came from the north but from the west, carrying with it the faintest scent of thawing earth. The ice on the river began to groan. Icicles fell from the eaves in sudden, startling crashes, One morning, villagers awoke to find the air almost tolerable, the sky less cruel. Snow melted in streaks, revealing the muddy chaos beneath. Broken fences, spoiled grain, and the carcasses of animals long buried in drifts. When the thaw finally came, it did not bring joy. It brought floods, rot, and the stench of death. All that the ice had hidden now emerged. But still, people took it as deliverance. The season of endurance had ended. And yet, as chroniclers noted, something changed permanently in those who survived. The Great Winter of 1434 became a kind of quiet scar on memory, a reminder that civilization, for all its stone and scripture, was still at the mercy of weather and time. You can almost picture it now. A peasant, years later, warming his hands over a small fire and saying to his children, "You think it's cold? You should have seen the year the river froze solid." But one might still wonder, what truly caused such a relentless winter? Was it only nature's whim, or did something far greater linger in the air above Europe that year? The science of cold, how the medieval climate shift changed everything. By the time the winter of 1434 had passed into the annals of memory, people began to ask why it had happened at all. Medieval folk did not separate faith and nature as we do now. The idea that weather could be an independent force, something not directly dictated by divine will, was only beginning to take hold. Yet the great winter had been so long, so unrelenting, that even priests began to wonder whether the heavens themselves were changing. If you had been alive then, you might have heard the word portent whispered over ale benches and market stalls. Everything was a sign of something. A cold sun, a blood-red moon, the migration of ravens. Each was a clue, a warning, or perhaps a judgment. And yet, in monasteries and workshops across Europe, a few curious minds began to record the cold with almost scientific precision. At St. Albans Abbey, a monk named Brother Nicholas of Dunstable began keeping what we would now call a temperature diary. He had no thermometer, of course. Instead, he measured frost by the depth of the ice in the well and by how long the candles would burn before their wax hardened from the chill. Each morning, he noted how the ink froze on his quill, how the bread cracked when broken, how even the breath of the cows turned into snow. Across the sea, in Flanders, merchants wrote in their account books of trading routes cut off by ice, of ships trapped in frozen harbors, of Baltic ports silent for months. Even the Hanseatic League, that great web of trade stretching from London to Novgorod, felt the freeze. Letters survive in which merchants plead for patience. "The sea is iron," one man wrote to his partner, "and the wind bears knives." These weren't mere anecdotes. They were data, though no one used that word yet. Centuries later, historians and climatologists would piece them together into a pattern and realize that the winter of 1434 was not an isolated cruelty. It was part of a larger shift, what we now call the Little Ice Age. From roughly the 14th to the 19th century, much of Europe endured colder winters, shorter growing seasons, and unpredictable harvests. Volcanoes erupted in far-off lands, spewing ash into the upper atmosphere. The sun itself dimmed during what scientists call the Spore minimum and later the Maunder minimum, periods of reduced solar activity. To the people of the time, these cosmic fluctuations were invisible, but their consequences were not. for them. It was as if nature had begun to lose its temper. The disappearing warmth. Before the cold centuries, Europe had been blessed by what historians call the medieval warm period. Grapes grew in England. Farmers in Scandinavia raised cattle where now only moss and snow remain. But by the 15th century, that warmth was retreating. Rivers froze that had never frozen before. Alpine glaciers advanced, swallowing pastures and villages whole. To the medieval imagination, these weren't just physical phenomena, they were moral ones. The cold was punishment, or perhaps purification. Chroniclers wrote that the sins of men have chilled the sun, but others, especially among the practical-minded monks and early natural philosophers, began to search for patterns rather than penance. They watched the skies, noted the winds, and compared records from old parchments. At the University of Paris, scholars debated whether comets drew heat from the world or whether the alignment of planets altered the humors of the Earth. None of them guessed that invisible particles high in the atmosphere could dim sunlight, but they sensed, dimly, that something vast and cyclical was at work. And if the cosmos had turned colder, then life must adapt or vanish. Living by the calendar of ice, the rhythm of medieval life was bound to the seasons more tightly than we can imagine. The planting and harvest of crops, the breeding of animals, even the timing of marriages and pilgrimages, all depended on weather that could be trusted. When that rhythm faltered, so too did society's fragile balance. Peasants, who had little margin between survival and starvation, felt it first. When a cold spring delayed planting, hunger followed months later like a shadow. Grain that should have filled granaries molded in damp barns. Bread shrank in size. The thin ale brewed from barley became weaker still. In the Chronicles of Cologne, a baker wrote of mixing sawdust with rye to stretch the loaves. In York, the city council passed laws to prevent bread fraud, though everyone knew the poor had no choice but to eat whatever their hands could afford. Even the animals adapted, or failed to. Sheep, those crucial sources of wool and meat, died in droves when snow covered the grass too long. And with less wool came fewer cloth exports, and with that, less income for towns dependent on trade. It was all connected, though few realized how tightly. A bad winter could ripple through the economy like a stone dropped into a frozen pond. The cold church. The church, as both spiritual and administrative power, also wrestled with the meaning of the freeze. Priests held processions through snow-choked streets, carrying relics and chanting litanies to ward off divine anger. Yet even they began to keep weather records, though they framed them in pious terms. A Latin entry from a monastery in Burgundy reads, Anno Domini 1434, the cold endured beyond all reason. The rivers became roads. The poor lay as snow upon the fields. We counted the days and found no warmth until the Passion. In monasteries, where order was sacred, cold was an intruder. The rule of Saint Benedict demanded prayer 8 times a day, but when the ink froze and the breath turned to frost on the psalters, some monks wrapped their fingers in cloth and prayed in silence rather than speak. The echoes of chanting in frozen stone halls became part of Europe's winter music. Outside those walls, the faith of the common folk shifted in subtle ways. Shrines dedicated to weather saints, Street Medid, protector from storms, and Saint Nicholas of Tolentino, intercessor against famine, grew in popularity. Candle processions wound through villages, their tiny lights flickering like fragile hope against the endless dark. The observers, Among the few who looked upon the cold not with fear, but with curiosity was a generation of early observers, men we might now call naturalists. In Prague, a scholar named Václav of Olomouc recorded the lengths of ice formation on the Vltava River, comparing each year's frost to the last. He didn't seek omens, he sought understanding. His notes, written in careful Latin, are still preserved, though his name is mostly forgotten. In Italy, the humanists of Florence and Padua began collecting meteorological curiosities, reports of strange weather from travelers and merchants. One Florentine letter from 1435 describes snow on the shoulders of Sicily as a marvel almost divine. To these Renaissance minds, nature was not just the backdrop of God's creation, it was the handwriting of God itself. And what better way to read his script than to measure it? It was in such small acts of curiosity that modern science began to flicker, as feebly at first as a candle in a winter chapel. The geography of hunger. While scholars debated causes, villagers cared only for consequences. The cold reshaped the landscape of survival. In the Low Countries, fields once fertile turned to marsh and ice. In Switzerland, glaciers advanced into valleys, crushing forests and even small churches under walls of ice. There are tales of bells ringing faintly beneath the ice years later, when the thaw came. Perhaps legend, perhaps memory turned into myth. Further north, Scandinavian settlements that had thrived during the earlier warm centuries now faltered. In Greenland, Norse colonies disappeared entirely, their farms buried under snow and silence. Ships sent to find them returned only with drifting tales of ruins and bones. To the rest of Europe, these vanishings were proof of divine mystery. To us, they marked the boundaries of the Little Ice Age's reach. The Great Adjustment. Humans, ever inventive, adapted. Where crops failed, they found new ones better suited to cold. Rye and oats replaced wheat in northern fields. In parts of Germany, families turned to brewing darker, stronger alesh that could survive in colder cellars. In Scotland, shepherds built stone shelters for their flocks. Houses themselves changed shape. Roofs grew steeper to shed snow. Chimneys, once rare, became essential. The architecture of warmth was born. Even clothing adapted. Layers of wool, linen, and fur stitched into garments that blurred class lines. Lords and peasants alike looked equally bundled, though the quality of their thread told the difference. This quiet ingenuity, seldom recorded, is perhaps the truest story of the age, the slow, practical victory of endurance over despair. The moral temperature. Yet the cold did not only freeze bodies, it chilled minds. In times of hardship, suspicion grows fertile. Some blamed foreigners, others witches. When crops failed, when cows died of frostbite, when the midwinter sun seemed too weak, people looked for someone to accuse. In a German town called Arras, chroniclers mention the first widespread witch trials linked to weather-making. Women were tortured until they confessed to calling frost from the north. It was superstition, but it came from fear, the fear of forces beyond control. The cold taught people how small they were, and not all could bear that lesson, the unseen science. Centuries later, when scientists would study ice cores and solar records, they would find the fingerprints of that age written in dust and ash. Volcanic eruptions, perhaps in the tropics, perhaps even in Alaska, had spewed microscopic particles that dimmed sunlight across the globe. Tree rings from Europe show stunted growth beginning around 1430. But no one then could have known that the same skies they prayed to held the answer. To them, the cold was both mystery and mirror, reflecting back their fragility, their endurance, and their faith. If we were to walk among them and whisper of climate systems and solar minima, they would look at us blankly, perhaps smile politely, and return to chopping wood. For understanding, while comforting, would not have warmed them. The philosophy of frost. When the thaw finally came, and the world softened again, philosophers and theologians reflected on what it all had meant. Some wrote that the cold had been God's way of tempering humanity, much like a blacksmith tempers steel with fire and ice alike. Others said it proved that creation itself had moods, that the earth was alive and restless. And perhaps, in a way, it was, because after the Great Winter, Europe's relationship to nature changed. People began to see it not just as a stage for human life, but as a living system, capricious, dangerous, and deserving of observation. The monks' weather notes, the merchants' frozen trade records, the scholars' sky watching, all became small stones in the foundation of modern climatology. The Little Ice Age was not only an environmental event, it was a turning point in how humans thought about their world. From then on, weather was not just fate, it was evidence, a quiet ending. As you imagine the world in 1435, picture the thawing of the Thames. Cracks forming, water moving once again, ice breaking with the sound of distant thunder. Imagine villagers standing on the banks, watching the river reclaim itself. Some smile, others cross themselves. A few throw in bits of bread, an offering to the returning current. No one yet calls it science, but they understand something has shifted. The cold has carved a lesson deeper than any sermon, that life bends but does not break. And in that spring, when the first green shoots appeared in the mud, a monk somewhere dipped his quill into thawed ink and wrote, "The frost departed, and we give thanks, though we know it shall return." Perhaps that is the truest wisdom of the age, not explanation, but acceptance. The world freezes, the world warms, and we go on gathering wood, mending roofs, and hoping for gentler seasons. The human cost: hunger, faith, and frozen hope. If the first months of the great winter had tested the body, the long decline that followed tested the spirit. For by the time the river cracked and the roads turned again to mud, the cost of survival had already been paid, in flesh, in faith, and in the quiet reshaping of a people who had stared too long into the white silence. Hunger made ordinary. At first, hunger was simply inconvenient. Bread grew smaller, stews thinner, and the familiar scent of roasting meat faded from every hearth. Then came the queasy fatigue of real starvation, the slowing of thought, the trembling of hands, the bargaining with one's own stomach. In the villages north of London, people learned a new vocabulary for hunger. A day with only broth was called a gray day. A day with nothing but boiled bark or ground acorns was a brown one. By February, white days, when snow was the only thing in the pot, had become common. Civic records from Norwich and Ghent show the same pattern. Grain stores emptied by midwinter, taxes delayed because there was nothing left to sell, crime rising quietly in the alleys after dusk. Yet theft itself changed character. It was not greed that drove it, but the thin, slow logic of need. A stolen loaf meant another night alive. Even the sheriffs looked the other way. And in that exhaustion, people discovered a dull solidarity. A woman might trade a handful of peas for a sliver of candle wax. A blacksmith might let his forge burn out to keep his neighbor's fire alive. The grand morality tales of the church, sin and salvation, heaven and hell, gave way to smaller ones. The mercy of sharing warmth, the dignity of surviving until morning. 2. The faith of cold hands. The church could not feed everyone, but it could keep them believing. Each Sunday, parishioners shuffled through snow to hear that their suffering was part of a greater plan. The sermons were stern at first, penitence for the sins of pride and gluttony, but as the frost deepened, even the priests softened. One account from York describes a friar preaching with blue lips, his voice trembling not from zeal, but from cold. "The Lord," he said, "does not measure your wealth, but how many you keep alive beside you." Those words spread faster than firewood. It was religion transformed into empathy, faith made practical. Churches became soup houses. Monks melted snow to make broth from bones. Nuns tore strips of their habits to bind frostbitten fingers. The great stone cathedrals, once monuments to eternity, became shelters, echoing with coughs instead of choirs. And yet, even there, superstition coiled through the smoke. Candles were lit to Saint Medard, guardian of rain, and to Saint Apollonia for the pain of teeth cracked by cold bread. People whispered charms as they blew on their hands. When the bells froze silent in their towers, villagers claimed the angels themselves had stopped singing. Still they prayed, because prayer was the only thing that required no fuel. 3. The body in winter. Chroniclers rarely describe what cold actually does to a human body, but the unrecorded truth is ordinary and terrible. Lips split, skin hardened into scales, joints locked as if rusted. Men walked as though carved from wood. The color of the world narrowed to 3 shades: gray, brown, and the faint orange of firelight. Illness multiplied. Bread made from spoiled grain carried the invisible poison of ergot, causing hallucinations that villagers mistook for visions. Mothers swore they saw saints walking through the snow. Others claimed to see their dead children smiling by the fire. Some miracles were simply symptoms. When famine pressed hardest, people ate what they could: nettles boiled to sludge, moss scraped from stones, strips of leather softened in water. In Lincolnshire, a man was fined for digging up a grave to take the burial shroud, not for desecration, but because cloth had become as precious as gold. Yet life continued with its dull insistence. Babies were still born, couples still married. Someone still mended the church roof even when the nails split with frost. Survival, though joyless, had become a kind of prayer. 4. The mind of despair. In long winters, time loses edges. The days blur into sameness, and with sameness comes despair. The Chronicles of Bruges speak of a sadness that clung like rime. People forgot what spring smelled like. Children born that year would not see grass until they could walk. It was during those blank weeks that rumors began, the half-mad stories that frost breeds. Some said the cold was caused by demons chained in the north. Others that witches had stolen the warmth to sell to the devil. Fear needed faces, and it found them easily. In certain towns, women who gathered herbs or owned black cats were burned, their ashes scattered on ice to break the spell of winter. Such horrors were not widespread yet. but they were seeds. Decades later, they would blossom into full-blown witch hunts. The Little Ice Age, in its quiet cruelty, had planted more than frost in the soil of Europe. It had sown fear itself. The economy of embers. Money lost meaning when markets froze. Coins were heavy, but warmth was light. A bundle of dry twigs could buy a day's labor. Salt, once the measure of wealth, became useless when food ran out to preserve. Instead, people bartered in sensations: heat, light, and the promise of smell. In taverns, a single mug of hot ale was worth more than a sermon. Traveling peddlers sold candles made from rendered fat, their wicks sputtering with the smell of meat. Those who owned small forests suddenly found themselves nobles of necessity. And in a curious inversion of class, the poor who knew how to gather, trap, and mend became teachers to their supposed betters. This reversal left its mark. Long after the thaw, songs survived about the winter when beggars ruled. For a brief season, practical knowledge outweighed birthright. Survival became its own currency. 6. The fire that refused to die. There is one story, half legend, half truth, from a hamlet near Canterbury. A tanner named Willem kept a small fire burning in his cottage for 103 days without letting it die. Neighbors brought embers from his hearth to reignite their own, calling it the communal flame. When the thaw came, Willem's cottage was celebrated not as miracle but as memory, proof that human care could outlast nature's cruelty. We have no portraits of Willem, no saint's halo, no relic. But perhaps he deserves one, for the real miracles of that winter were not divine, they were domestic. The small, ordinary acts that kept one another alive. Sharing a loaf, lending a spark, holding a hand through the night. 7. The price in faith. Not everyone survived. In the records of St. Paul's Cathedral, the number of winter burials in 1434 doubled. Entire families disappeared from the rolls of taxpayers. Yet even in grief, communities sought meaning. Funerals became acts of resistance. Bells rang despite the ice. Candles burned despite the wind. To bury the dead properly was to declare that order still existed. And when spring finally arrived, priests led processions not of mourning but of gratitude. They blessed wells, sprinkled holy water on the thawing ground, and proclaimed that God had returned the warmth of his breath. Behind the words, however, lingered a quieter truth, the knowledge that the world could, and likely would, turn cold again. 8. The taste of return. When the ice broke and the first fish appeared in the river shallows, people feasted as though they had conquered death itself. The meal was meager: eels, a few onions, coarse bread, but it tasted of deliverance. Children who had never known green saw grass for the first time and laughed without knowing why. Markets reopened. Carts rolled once more along roads long buried under snow. Bells rang louder, merchants shouted, dogs barked. The world was noisy again, and the noise itself was joy. But underneath that joy lay a subtle change. People had learned caution. They salted more meat, stored more grain, repaired their roofs before autumn. They had been taught, brutally, that nature owed them nothing. Hope became humble, not a vision of abundance, but the quiet wish for enough. 9. Memory as survival. Years later, when travelers asked old men about the great winter, they would not speak of dates or kings. They spoke of sounds, the groaning of ice, the silence of snow, the first drip of thaw. One said, "I remember the winter when words froze in the air." Another, The year I saw my breath turn into angels. They exaggerated, as memory always does, but through exaggeration they preserved truth. The story of the freeze became a moral compass, retold to children who complained of minor cold. Be grateful, the elders said. You have not known the year the river froze. In that way, the trauma of hunger transformed into heritage, a warning disguised as bedtime story. X. The shape of hope. The historian reading those records centuries later might see only numbers, grain prices, death tolls, parish accounts. But between those lines lies something immeasurable, the stubborn refusal of hope to die. Hope, in 1434, was not optimism. It was discipline. It was the act of rising to chop wood when you already knew it wouldn't be enough. It was lighting a candle for someone else's prayer because your own hands were too numb. The great winter forged a quieter faith, faith in endurance itself. Out of that endurance grew new habits of observation, compassion, and realism that would shape the later centuries. Europe emerged thinner, sadder, wiser. When the chronicler of Bruges finally closed his ledger at the end of that terrible season, he wrote only one line. We have survived the cold, and the world is still here. He could not know that the same cold would return again and again, in different guises, through famine, plague, and war. But the lesson would remain the same, that humanity endures not because it conquers nature, but because it learns to live beside its indifference. As spring thickened into summer, the villagers of England and Flanders rebuilt the rhythms of ordinary life. Children played in puddles that had once been ice. The Thames flowed freely, carrying merchant barges once more. And on warm evenings, when the light lingered late, someone would inevitably point to the river and say, almost wistfully, "Do you remember when it froze solid?" No one answered. They simply nodded and tended the fire. The thaw, rebuilding, memory, and the quiet lessons of the cold. The thaw began not with a storm or a sign from heaven, but with something so small that few even noticed. A single droplet of water, falling from a thatched eave, landing on frozen earth with a sound softer than prayer. Then another, then 100. By early March, the stillness that had defined the world for months began to break. Snowmelt gurgled along the ditches. Birds returned hesitantly, as if testing whether the air would hold them. The river, once a white plain of silence, began to murmur again. Its voice, cracking, then rushing, then roaring, was like the sound of life remembering itself. For those who survived, it was not joy they felt first. It was disbelief. People stepped outside their cottages and squinted at the light, as though the sun itself had changed shape. Everything was unfamiliar. The smell of thawing mud, the sound of dripping roofs, the sudden weight of running water. After so long measuring time by the frost on the doorframe, the return of warmth felt almost intrusive. But the thaw, like every mercy, came with a price. The ruins beneath the snow. When the ice retreated, it revealed what it had hidden. Dead livestock, half-buried tools, collapsed barns, and unmarked graves. The beauty of the white world had been a disguise for decay. As the rivers swelled with meltwater, they carried away not only snow but the remnants of the long-suffering winter had claimed. Chroniclers wrote that the smell of rot filled the air like incense for the dead. Villagers dug pits to bury what the ice had left behind. The ground, softened by thaw, turned into mire. Roads became rivers of mud. The relief of warmth was mingled with a new misery, the task of cleaning, rebuilding, and remembering. In London, when the Thames finally broke its icy shell, it flooded. The wooden stalls of the Frost Fair collapsed, their contents carried downstream. Candles, bread crusts, charms, all swallowed by the current. People who had laughed atop the frozen river now stood on its banks, watching it reclaim its power. The world was no longer dead, but it was wounded. And healing, as anyone who has ever survived hardship knows, hurts in its own way. 2. The labor of rebuilding. Once the first shock of thaw had passed, work began. Roofs were patched, walls cleaned, livestock replaced. Men traded axes for shovels, cutting through layers of mud rather than ice. Every sound, the thud of wood, the creak of carts, the hiss of fire rekindled, seemed to declare that the season of paralysis was over. Women took stock of what had survived: jars of dried beans, scraps of cloth, handfuls of seeds saved through sheer stubbornness. Those seeds were planted not just in soil, but in hope. They knew the next harvest might fail, but still they planted. That act, simple and repetitive, was civilization's quiet defiance. In parish records across England, one phrase appears again and again that spring: restored by hands of the village. It is a small sentence, but in it lies the entire story of recovery. No grand decree from kings or bishops, just the calloused, practical effort of people who refused to let their world vanish. Stone by stone, plank by plank, the landscape was mended. Chimneys rose again, church bells were rehung, and animals returned to pasture. It was not prosperity, but it was peace. 3. The memory of cold. Yet memory lingered. In taverns, people still spoke of that winter in the same tone they used for wars or plagues. It became a point of time itself. Everything was before or after the Great Freeze. Parents told children how the rivers had frozen solid enough for horses to cross, how ale had turned to slush in the barrel, how bread had broken like stone. The stories were told not to frighten, but to warn. Every generation since has done the same, turning suffering into folklore and folklore into wisdom. The cold became part of Europe's collective imagination. Pain had turned to narrative, and narrative to caution. The lesson was simple but profound. Never take warmth for granted. In some villages, people began holding an annual feast when spring arrived. A modest meal of bread, broth, and ale. They called it the thaw supper. No matter how poor the year, they would gather, light candles, and give thanks that the ground was soft again. The ritual spread across regions, blending into local traditions, each adding its own flavor of gratitude. History records kings and battles, but it forgets such customs. Yet these small acts of remembrance are what actually hold civilization together. 4. Lessons in humility. When people later looked back on that winter, they found that the cold had changed more than their fortunes. It had changed their perspective. The lords who once taxed their peasants harshly began to realize that without their labor, no estate could stand. Monks who had once shut their doors to beggars now opened them in compassion. Even the merchants, who measured worth in silver, saw the futility of hoarded wealth when it could not buy warmth. Across Europe, in ways subtle and unrecorded, humility crept into human life. It was as if the cold had carved away arrogance along with comfort. One chronicler wrote, "The frost took from us the pretense of dominion. We learned that we belong to the world, not it to us." In those few words, Centuries of theology were quietly rewritten. The cold had been a teacher, and though its lessons were cruel, they were lasting. The science of thaw. The observant monks who had once measured the depth of frost now measured the progress of warmth. They noted when the crocus bloomed, when birds returned, when the river ran freely for 3 weeks without refreezing. They charted these signs not as curiosities, but as reassurance. In a small monastery near Rouen, Brother Etienne wrote an entire treatise titled De Natura Frigoris, on the nature of cold. It was part theology, part observation. He argued that God's creation had cycles of rest and renewal, and that even the frost was a form of divine rhythm. The world sleeps, he wrote, and in its waking becomes wise. His manuscript would later be forgotten, but the idea persisted, that climate and spirit are intertwined, that humans are not separate from the world's moods, but participants in them. And perhaps this is the greatest legacy of the Great Winter, that it nudged humanity one step closer to understanding the earth as living, dynamic, and shared. 6. Faith rekindled. As spring deepened into summer, the churches filled again, but now the prayers sounded different. Gratitude had replaced fear. In many towns, processions were held not to ward off storms, but to celebrate the return of warmth. Priests carried torches and sprinkled holy water on the thawing ground, blessing it for new life. The sound of bells, silent for so long, rang across the valleys like laughter. But even in celebration, people remembered restraint. They no longer asked for endless comfort. They prayed instead for balance, for seasons that would come and go as they should. This new humility became a cornerstone of medieval spirituality, a quieter, steadier faith that did not demand miracles, but appreciated moderation. 7. The landscape reborn. By midsummer, the signs of rebirth were everywhere. Fields shimmered with young grain. The scent of baking bread drifted once more from open windows. Cattle grazed where snowdrifts had been. And yet, to the eyes of those who had lived through it, the landscape was never quite the same. Trees that had split from the frost stood twisted and scarred. Churches bore watermarks from floods. The earth itself carried memory, like wrinkles on an old face. Travelers described how the light seemed different that year, softer, golden, reflective. It was as if the sun, too, had learned mercy. Artists painted scenes of ice and thaw in the margins of illuminated manuscripts. Poets wrote of the sleeping year awakened. Even merchants, ever practical, printed small carvings of fire and frost on their ledgers as reminders that fortune, like weather, can freeze without warning. 8. The economics of renewal. Trade returned with the warmer winds. The Baltic ships once trapped in ice carried timber and furs again. London's markets bustled. Carpenters found work rebuilding bridges. Brewers returned to their craft, their ale once more fermenting in barrels that no longer froze solid. Yet the lessons of scarcity lingered. People began to store food more carefully. Local councils encouraged the creation of common granaries, shared stores of grain to be used in lean years. It was a small act of collective foresight, but it would save lives in later famines. Economic historians often call such measures primitive welfare, but they were more than policy. They were memory institutionalized. The people of the 15th century did not invent charity. The cold simply made it impossible to ignore. 9. The quiet philosophy of survival. In time, the great winter faded into the background of history, overshadowed by wars and plagues yet to come. But for those who lived through it, its mark endured in the smallest details of daily life. In every cottage, a bundle of dry wood was kept by the hearth for the next frost. Every child was taught to thank the fire before sleep. Every sermon contained at least one reminder that comfort is fleeting. Perhaps that is how wisdom works, not as revelation, but as habit. The people who endured the great winter did not see themselves as heroes or martyrs. They were simply people who had learned that survival was sacred. One peasant, interviewed decades later by a wandering friar, said it best. The frost taught us patience. The thaw taught us gratitude. Between them, we became human. The return of normal days. By 1435, the records show something remarkable: boredom. Parish accounts resumed their usual business. Tithes collected, disputes over land, repairs to the church roof. The mundane had returned, and it was beautiful. Children born during the winter learned to walk in the warmth of that summer. Marriages were celebrated again, not as desperate unions for survival, but as joyful gatherings. Music, silent for so long, filled taverns once more. When the first frost came that autumn, people felt the old fear stir, but it passed. Fires burned easily now, and the smell of smoke was comforting rather than ominous. Life, steady and cyclical, had resumed its rhythm. No one ever called it a triumph. It was simply the return of enough. 11. The long memory. Centuries later, historians would reconstruct the great winter from fragments: ledgers, letters, grain prices, parish records. But for the people who lived it, memory was not a document. It was a feeling. The chill in their bones when the wind blew from the north. The instinct to stock the pantry before December. The quiet reverence when lighting the first candle of winter. These became cultural reflexes, inherited like language. Even now, in the old folk tales of Northern Europe, there are echoes of that season. The sleeping river, the year without warmth, the saint of the unending night. Stories woven not to frighten, but to remind that hardship comes and goes and returns again. 12. The final reflection. If you were to stand on the banks of the Thames today, you would see only water, restless, brown, indifferent. But beneath its surface lies the same current that once froze into a road of ice and fear. History, like the river, flows and freezes and flows again. The great winter of 1434 is distant, yet familiar. Its lessons whisper still, that human endurance is not loud or heroic, but patient, that gratitude grows best in cold soil, and that warmth, when it returns, is sacred not because it is given, but because it is earned. So the next time you feel the air turn sharp and see your breath in the dark, remember those who stood before their thatched cottages 6 centuries ago, staring at a frozen world and saying quietly to one another, "We will endure." And they did.